Hello and welcome to the second session of the Risk Management Basics course, when we are going to ask what's a risk assessment and look at what a risk assessment is, what it's for, and how we plan one. And this is often where people start when they think about risk management. They jump straight into the risk assessment. They actually jump into the assessment part itself, but they do that without planning, and they do that without really thinking what the purpose is. So what I want to go through over the next 20 minutes or so is to put the risk assessment into context and to give you the tools so that you can plan one effectively, to understand what it is you're trying to achieve, who the client is, what the assessment is meant to give them, and what's the most effective way to conduct that. So we're going to start by putting this into context, and then we're going to look at how you plan the assessment. Then we're going to look at understanding the organization and understanding the risks, because that's one of the key points before you actually get into preparing the assessment itself and assessing the risks. And then we'll talk a little bit about risk reporting. And at the very end, there's a little bonus, so stick around for a bonus session that will help put all of this into context with a real-world example. As a quick reminder, this is session 2, and a lot of what I talk about here is going to use terminology that I've already addressed in session 1. And if you haven't been through session 1 yet, I suggest you pause this video, quickly go through session 1, and then come back to this, or at least have the course notes available for session 1, because that will just help clarify the terminology and some of the things that I'm talking about so that there's no confusion. So let's start with talking about what the risk assessment is and what it's for. If we don't understand what risks we face, if we don't understand the kind of risks that an organization may have to deal with, the organization's always going to be reactive. You're waiting for something to happen. But by conducting a risk assessment, by understanding the kind of risks that you might face, you can be proactive. You can start to mitigate those risks or exploit those risks by using risk-based decision making. And the way that we can do that is by conducting a risk assessment. We use a risk assessment to understand the risks that the organization faces. And we have to have a process for this. This is something that I talked about in session 1. There is a lot of different terminology used. There are a lot of different processes used. So unless you have a process to talk about risk, and unless you have a process to assess your risk in a standard format, you're not going to be able to have those discussions, and you won't be able to have effective risk-based decision making. So the point of the risk assessment is to standardize this with a standard process, standard terminology, so that everyone assesses their risks in the same way, and when you're having the discussions, everyone understands what you're talking about. So let's look at the process now for conducting a risk assessment. This lays out the 5-step process that we're going to go through in this session. And the thing that I'd probably stress most is we're not looking at just the assessment part. We're not jumping straight into a spreadsheet or a calculator. We're not starting to allocate ratings to the risks. We're trying to look at the whole process. And I'll explain why in a minute, but the key point is, unless you have an overall process and a system, your assessment probably won't work. And that actually begins with the planning phase. We've got to plan things out. Then we need to understand the organization and start to gather the information that we can use for assessment. We then need to have a structure for the assessment before we jump in to what people often see as the meat of this, which is the actual assessment itself, adding the data to the template and starting to come up with some of the recommendations or considerations around the risks. And the final thing we need is a way to report that and a way to share that information with the organization. And again, if you don't have all 5 of these components in place, your assessment probably won't be as effective as it should be, and it might fail altogether. I have seen risk assessments where an assessment has been completed. There has been a spreadsheet and a report and a series of ratings, but it's failed to answer the question that the decision makers asked in the first place, and therefore it wasn't effective. So try to think about this as an overall process, an overall system that is going to support your risk assessment. So let's start at the beginning with planning. What do we need to do to plan out a risk assessment? All we're trying to do here is figure out what the purpose of the assessment is. So what's the objective? What's the scope and the parameters? So are we trying to answer a specific question? Are we trying to create a baseline assessment? Are we looking at the whole organization, just part of the organization? And then the parameters, like how much time do we have? Is there a budget? And that leads into the team. Is there a team available? And if so, we need to select the assessment team. Who's going to be working on this with us? And what we need to do at the end of this is develop a small project plan. For a large assessment, it could be a big project plan, but you really just need a basic project plan. What's the intent? What's the scope? Key timings, key resources available, and when the deliverable has to be prepared and delivered. And with that plan in place, what you can then do is start scheduling things. You can start planning things in more detail. Imagine without having a plan, if you just launch into the assessment, you could miss the target altogether. You could create an assessment that doesn't answer the question, or it runs outside the scope of what people actually want and need. The next stage is understanding. What we need to do first of all is understand the organization, what it does, where it operates, some of the challenges it faces. And you need to do this certainly as a consultant or if you're an external expert who has come into an organization. But equally, you need to do this if you already work for an organization. It's actually very easy to have a slight misunderstanding of what your organization actually does. You'll understand what you do and you'll understand how you fit into the organization. But do you really understand your organization? Do you understand the overall scope and reach of its operations? So take some time, no matter where you're coming from, to start to gather information that will be internal information. So you'll have processes and procedures. You'll have open source information like news stories and company reports and the About Us page and things like that. And one of the key things is interviews. So you will spend, or you should spend, a lot of time interviewing people because that's really where you find out the most. It will help you confirm if a process is completed and followed as it's written, or do people change it? You will find out why people don't follow a process. You will get a sense of what the main challenges people in each division of the organization face. And all of this is a very, very rich data source when you actually get around to the assessment itself. Part of this is also to review that information. One of the things that people often overlook is keeping detailed notes and being able to go back and review these. So you are going to be gathering a huge amount of information during this part of the assessment, the understanding phase. So just make sure you're capturing it properly, but then also review it. Review it for gaps and review it for discrepancies. If one person says, we have an excellent process for, let's say, crisis management, you may speak to someone else that says, we have no process for crisis management. So where does that misconception, where does that difference come from? Well, you may need to go back. It's an information gap. You may need to go back and conduct some more interviews or track something down. So the understanding isn't necessarily done in one phase. It's a multi-stage process that you will come back to. And what I would say is use as much time as possible on this phase as you can. So the next thing we need to do is actually prepare the assessment itself. So I know everyone is keen to jump into the actual assessment and start putting in the gradings and things, but we need to understand what structure are we going to use and what methodology are we going to use first. Now, it could be that this is a structure that the organization uses as a standard, in which case you should follow that. It could be that you're going to adopt an international standard or an international guideline or some form of guideline that's provided by your industry. If none of those things are in place, you may need to develop your own. But the important thing is before you start doing any of the assessment, understand the structure, understand how you're going to categorize your threats, because that will drive a lot of the structure of the final report. Understand the methodology you're going to use for the assessment, and understand the grading system. And the key thing is to make sure that everyone on the team is using the same structure, using the same system. Because obviously there'll be huge problems if you get into the actual assessment and then discover that somebody has been doing their own thing. And that can happen. If you remember at the very beginning, I said there's a lot of terminology, there's a lot of different ways to approach risk management. So the key thing here is make sure before you start conducting the actual assessment itself that everyone is on the same page. So finally, we get to go on and assess the risks. So you're going to take all of the information you've consolidated and populate the framework that you built in order to complete the assessment. And that framework and that template could be a Word document, it could be a spreadsheet, it could be a piece of software. Whatever is most appropriate for your organization, whatever fits for you, and whichever matches any guidelines and standards you have in place. That's the template you're going to use. So all of the information from the understanding stage is now going to be added to that template. However, you might find that there are still gaps. You might find anomalies. You might have had two elements that you thought were going to be very, very similar or wildly different. Now, that doesn't mean that the process is wrong. This is part of the reason that we have a methodology. It's to take away some of our preconceived notions and try to give us an objective view. But if something doesn't feel right at this stage, it's perfectly okay to go back and gather some information, go back and clarify something. Make sure that you understood what the person said fully. Did you get the right piece of data? And if it still results in the same answer, then it's fine. You can move on. But if you need to, you can always go back and ask more questions at this stage. Once all of that is done, you're going to finalize your assessment. Now, by finalizing the assessment, I still mean that there's some work to do, but essentially your assessment part is now complete. You should have a document that will give you all of the risks you've identified. They should all have some kind of rating or grading, and you should be able to put those in order from most severe to least severe, because that's what you're then going to use for decision making. One small health warning: please don't rush to get to this stage. This is probably the biggest single mistake that I see people make, and I've made this mistake. I've rushed to get to the actual assessment part itself. If you do, you run the risk of misunderstanding the intent, what you're trying to do in the first place. And you, as I said earlier, you have produced an assessment, but it doesn't answer the question people need. And this is actually a much bigger challenge when you're short of time. So there may be an urgent requirement to complete an assessment for a very specific need. But if you rush to the assessment part, you may have overlooked the very specific question you're trying to answer, and the time runs out. By the time you deliver the report the decision makers need, you haven't answered the question and time has run out. So don't rush to this point. Make sure you understand the intent. And make sure you also understand the context. Make sure you understand the organization. If you rush through, obviously you don't have as much time for gathering information, so you miss the key information. But the final point here, by rushing through, you are much more likely to deliver a subjective, emotion-led assessment, not a data-led assessment. Now, risk is always subjective. We always bring biases into whatever we do, and risk is no different. However, by applying the process, by sticking to the process properly, by using a structured approach, we can take a lot of the subjectivity and emotion out. But if we rush through and go straight into the evaluation part, we're much more likely to be emotion-led and not data-led. So please, whatever you do, don't rush to get to this point. Now that we have all the information, we're going to report it and we're going to present it to the decision makers. So the client or key stakeholders, those could be internal or it could be an external client. They need the information. So the first thing you're going to do is take your assessment and draft a report. And whatever format is most appropriate. It could be a dashboard in a piece of software, it could be some graphs in Excel, it could be a PowerPoint presentation, or it could be a written report. And if you remember back to the first session when I talked about risk statements, this is where the risk statements can be very, very powerful. So you could have a prose report with all of your risk statements written out, describing the risks in detail. And alongside that, you could have some metrics, you could have some graphs. So again, it's a very comprehensive way to produce the report. But the key thing is you're going to produce the report and you will have identified what that should look like early on in the process. That should have been identified way back when you're doing the planning and when you're planning out the assessment itself. You then need to review it. And I would say you review it in two stages. You start by reviewing it with the key stakeholder, or the client sponsor, the project sponsor. Review that with them because they should have the best view of what the intent is and also the parameters and scope. So go through that, and that's your first sense check of the document. And you may need to go back and make some adjustments and changes. The second way to do it, and the other way to do it, is to complete a workshop. Workshops are very powerful, but you have a lot of people in the room and then you start to get group dynamics involved. So normally I try to leave the workshop until a little bit later once I've done an initial review with key stakeholders to make sure that it's broadly answering the questions that they want before we come into the workshop. And that can cut down a lot of argument and back and forth and questioning. Now, I'm not suggesting that you change the report to make it look better, and I'm not suggesting that every comment or recommendation will be valid, but you do need to have this discussion with the client, with the users, to make sure they're getting the information that they want and that they understand what's in your report. But once you've completed the reviews in the workshop, you publish the final report, and that won't change. That is then the risk assessment report as of that date. Now, you may go back and review it later, but then you create a review, you create an update to the report. The original report shouldn't change, because what that's going to let you do is determine, have you been able to address the risks and mitigate them later on? You need to know where you started in order to determine if you've made any progress. And the final stage is then you determine the next steps. You may have answered the question for decision makers, in which case your assessment is over and there's no follow-up. Or the assessment might be a benchmark assessment that you're going to create a bunch of different mitigation measures for, because you now want to do a lot of risk treatment and address your risks. The next steps at this stage will be determining what you want to do with the report. So what comes next? You move to the address stage, which I talked about a moment ago. You're going to address those risks. You may monitor triggers and flags you've identified. You may have said, if event X were to happen, this would cause significant risk. You can start to put those into some kind of horizon scanning program. You lock the report. As I said, that then becomes the report. That is the risk assessment report. It's finalized, and that is your baseline for other assessments and other work. And then you're going to work on decision making. So it's not a standalone business function. This is really, really important. The risk assessment is there to help decision makers make better decisions so that you can achieve your objectives. So it's not a standalone process where you finish the report, file it, and you're done. That should never be the case. It should always be developed with a view to helping the decision makers to help the business. So remember, it is part of the decision making. So you may still be involved in decision making. You may be asked to contribute to that or explain some of the findings. But the key thing is this should be integrated into the business function. So we've covered quite a lot of ground. Let's quickly go back through and look at the risk assessment again as a reminder. So we're trying to be proactive, not reactive. And in order to do that, we need to understand the risks that the organization faces. And the way that we do that is through the risk assessment. We have our 5-stage process. It's not about jumping straight into filling out a spreadsheet. So we start by planning, understand what we're trying to do, the scope and the parameters. Then we're going to understand the organization. We're going to gather information, conduct interviews, so we really understand the organization and what it's dealing with. We've got to prepare the assessment. We have to know what the structure we're using, what the methodology we're using, how we're going to grade risks, and everyone in the team has to be on the same page with that. Then we finally get on to the assessment itself. Then we're able to populate the template and actually complete the assessment itself. And the final stage is reporting. We're going to draft a report and deliver that to the client either as a written report, verbally, or through a workshop, or sometimes a combination of all of those. And then we'll determine the next steps and what we're going to do next. As a reminder, please don't rush to the assessment stage. When you begin an assessment, you shouldn't be even thinking about what does the spreadsheet look like until you've completed the other stages up to assessment preparation. Think about the scope and the context, plan it out, develop understanding, then move on to the assessment. Remember, if you go into this too quickly, you're probably not going to have an effective risk assessment. So that wraps up session 2 of the Risk Management Basics course. In session 1, we looked at what do we mean by risk? How do we talk about risk? How do we describe a risk? How do we break it down? And in this session, we've looked at how we assess a risk. How can we actually go through a process to give us the information that we need for decision makers to make better risk-based decisions? And the way we do that is with the risk assessment. And in session 3, we're then going to look at what comes next. How do we address risks? Now that we've identified our risks, what options do we have to address those? What do we do with them? And how do we use those to help make decisions? But don't worry, I haven't forgotten. I did promise you a special bonus. So once you've finished this video, if you look beneath this, you will see that there's a bonus video for this session. And that bonus video walks through a fictitious organization, XYZ company, that you should remember from session 1, the fictitious company that has an operation in the country Janwick. That was the example we used in session 1. So what I've done is I've taken XYZ company and I've taken the process we have here and I've put together an example of what this might look like in reality. How would the risk manager structure it? Who would they talk to? How would they complete the assessment? So in addition to the theoretical part here, this bonus episode should put it all in context and give you an example. So I hope you enjoy that. I hope it gives you some more information, and I look forward to seeing you in session 3.